Flat Stanley, written by Jeff Brown, illustrated by Scott Nash, performed by Miss Squires reading classes.
Hey, come and look, Arthur Lamb called from the bedroom. He shared with his brother Stanley, Mr. and Mrs. Lamb carried greeting for pause and correct speech.
Hey, it's for horses, Arthur, not people, says Mrs. Lamb, but look, it says the Arthur pointing.
Across Stanley's bed lay the enormous bulletin board. It had fallen on Stanley during the night. Mr. and Mrs. Lamb hurried to lift it from the bed. But Stanley wasn't hurt. What's going on here, he said, cheerfully sitting up. Heavens, cried Miss Lambchop.
Gosh, said Arthur. Stanley's flat as a pancake, said Mr. Lambchop. Darnest thing I ever seen.
Mrs. Lambchop said, and let's all have breakfast, then we'll hear what Dr. Shannon has to say.
In his office, Dr. Dan examined Stanley. How do you feel, he asked. I feel sort of tickly after I got up, Stanley said.
But I feel fine now. Well, that's how it is with the classes, said Dr. Dan.
The nurse took Stanley's measurements. He was 4 feet tall, about a foot wide, and half an inch thick.
Being flat could be fun. Stanley enjoying going in and out of rooms by sliding through the crack at the bottom of the door. Arthur tried to, but he just banged his head. Being flat could be exciting.
During the holidays, Stanley was invited to visit his friend Thomas in California. Mr. Lamb brought home an enormous brown paper envelope and said, Stanley, try this on for size.
The envelope fit Stanley perfectly, and the next morning his parents slid into it along with the egg salad sandwich and mailed him from the front of the box on the corner.
Stanley had a fine time in California.
Thomas's family returned him in a beautiful white envelope they'd made themselves. They marked it airmail and wrote valuable, and this ended up on both sides. In the park one Sunday afternoon, Stanley and Arthur watched some boys flying big kites. Someday Arthur said, I would like to have a big kite. You can fly me, Arthur, Stanley said. Come on! He gave Arthur a string and attached it to himself. Then he ran across the grass to catch the wind. Up, up, up went Stanley.
Arthur let out all the string, and Stanley soared high above the trees. Everyone stood still to watch, but Arthur got tired of running with the empty spool of string. Wedging a fork of tree, he went off for a hot dog.
He didn't notice when Stanley became tangled in the branches of the tree. Half an hour passed before Arthur heard Stanley shout and climb up to set him free.
Arthur apologized over and over again that evening, but Stanley was still crossed.
The next morning, Mr. Lambchop and Stanley met their neighbor, Mr. O.J. Dart, director of the famous Museum of Art. Mr. Dart looked worried. Another valuable painting has been stolen from the famous museum last night, he told Stanley and his father.
The police suspect a gang of sneak thieves. They work at night by sneakery, which makes them even difficult to catch. Stanley had an idea. He explained it to Mr. Dart. Excellent, said Mr. Dart. We'll try out our plan tonight.
That evening in the main hall of the museum, Mr. Dart showed Stanley the most expensive painting in the world. Next to it was an empty picture frame. And now Stanley said, Mr. Dart, it's time for your disguise.
Stanley showed Mr. Dart the disguise he had brought. This is a really good one, my cowboy hat and a red bandana. I'm sorry, Mr. Dart said, but we don't have any cowboys pictures here.
You must wear the disguise I have chosen. Stanley could hardly speak when he saw Mr. Dart's disguise. I look like a girl, he protested, but Stanley was a good sport, so he put it on. In the main hall, Stanley climbed into the empty picture frame and stood very still. Very nice, said Mr. Dart, and went off to arrange the rest of their plan. Now Stanley was alone. The hall was very dark, but enough moonlight came through the windows for him to see the world's most expensive painting.
Maybe the neat thieves won't come, he thought. Then quick, a glow of yellow light shone faintly in the center of the hall. A trapdoor had opened in the floor. The neat thieves carrying lanterns came up into the hall.
The thieves took the world's most expensive paint off the wall. "This is it, Max," said the first thief, whose name was Luther. "In all this great city, there is no one to suspect us." Then Luther saw Stanley and his friend. "I thought she-girls were supposed to smile," Max, he said. "This one looks scared." Stanley managed a tiny smile. "She's smiling sort of," Max, he said.
And what a pretty little thing she is, too. That made Stanley furious. In his loudest voice, he shouted, "Police! Mr. Dart, the sneak thieves are here!"
Max Luther whispered, "I think I heard the sheep girl yell. Oh boy, yelling pictures. We both need a rest." Max whispered back, "You'll get a rest, all right." Mr. Bart rushing in with lots of policemen.
"You'll get arrested, that's what." The sneak thieves were quickly handcuffed and led away to jail. The next morning, Stanley Lamchart got a medal from the chief of police. The day after that, his picture was all in the newspaper.
For a while, Stanley was famous. People would point him out and whisper over there, Agnes, Stanley Lamchart, the one who caught the museum robbers, and things like that. But then people would begin to make fun of him. Hi, super skinny, they would call.
Late one night, Arthur woke up to the sound of Stanley crying. "What's wrong?" he said. Stanley sighed. "I want to be a regular shape again, like other people. It's not fair."
"You're brave," Arthur said. "You really are." Then Arthur had an idea. He turned on the light and ran to the big toy box in the corner. He tossed aside toy soldiers, airplanes, and boat models. "Got it," he said, holding up an old bicycle pump.
"Okay," Stanley said after a moment, "but take it easy." He stood at the end of the hose in his mouth, clamping his lip tightly so nowhere could escape. Arthur began to pump.
"If it hurts or anything, wiggle your hand," he said. Stanley's top half began to swell. Stanley got bigger and bigger. His pajama bottoms burst off. Pop, pop, pop.
Soon he was all rounded out except for his right foot. He shook it the foot twice and it swelled to match the other one. There stood Stanley Lamchart as if he had never been flat at all. "Thank you," Arthur said. Stanley said, "Thank you very much."
Mr. and Mrs. Lamchart came in to see what the boys were up to so late at night. "George," said Mrs. Lamchart, "Stanley's round again." "I'm the one who did it," Arthur said. "I blew him up." Miss Lamchart made hot chocolate to celebrate, and several toasts were drunk to Arthur for his cleverness.
When the little party was over, Mr. and Mrs. Lamchart tucked the brothers back into bed and turned out the light. "Good night," said Stanley and Arthur. Very soon, all the Lamcharts were asleep.